24 years. That was the duration of the nightmare. Why did the people endure the hunger and the cold for so long? It wasn't patience, it was absolute terror. Nicolae Ceaușescu created a system of total control. The Securitate listened to every phone line. Neighbors watched neighbors. To speak a word against the state was not just risky. It was a guarantee to vanish without a trace. Silence was the only way to survive. But the pressure cooker finally exploded. December 1989. The system collapsed in days. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a sudden crash. The footage shows the dictator stands on the balcony of the Central Committee building. He waves his hand. He expects cheers. Instead, the audio captures the roar of an angry crowd. His face goes pale. Confusion washes over him. He fled the capital. He took a helicopter, but the pilot betrayed him. He landed on a dirt road. The hunter became the hunted. At first glance, a legal tribunal, but in reality, a hurried liquidation. The trial lasted less than 2 hours. The soldiers did not hesitate. They dragged the couple to a freezing courtyard next to the latrines. They opened fire before the command was even given. 120 bullets hit the targets. The dust settled over the snow. January 26, 1918. A cold winter in Scornicești. The conditions were primitive. A small peasant house with mud floors. Nicolae was just one mouth to feed among 10 children. Hunger was not an event here. It was a daily routine. He didn't stay to plow the fields. As a teenager, he packed his few belongings and headed for Bucharest. Official records listed him as a shoemaker's apprentice. But he wasn't interested in leather and nails. He was looking for a fight. He found the illegal Romanian Communist Party. Under King Carol II, membership was a crime. Police spies watched the workshops and the streets. Why did the regime fear a teenage apprentice? It seemed absurd, but his police file was already marked dangerous agitator. At 17, the law caught him. Handcuffs clicked shut. The charge was anti-government activity. The next decade was a blur of iron bars and concrete. Between 1933 and 1944, he rotted in prisons like Doftana and Caranțebeș. These weren't correctional facilities, they were training grounds. The archives contained mugshots, a thin, angry young man staring defiantly into the lens. Prison became his university. He sat at the feet of older revolutionaries, specifically Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej. Ceaușescu listened, learned the internal codes, and swore absolute loyalty to the future leader. Then the world broke open. 1944. The Soviet Red Army crossed the border. Newsreels show Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Bucharest. Communism wasn't just an underground idea anymore. It was the new law. By 1947, the monarchy was abolished. The People's Republic was declared. Gheorghiu Dej took the summit, and Ceaușescu stood right behind him. At first glance, he was just a loyal subordinate, but in reality, he was positioning himself for the throne. He climbed the ladder with military precision. Deputy Defense Minister, Politburo member. He controlled the army files and the party lists. Events accelerated. March 1965. Gheorghiu Dej died. The power vacuum was instant. The party needed a successor, someone they thought they could manage. They picked the quiet, loyal deputy. In the frame, Ceaușescu stands at the podium, accepting the title of General Secretary. He wasted no time. By 1967, he was head of state. By 1968, all rivals were sidelined. The apprenticeship was over. August 21st, 1968, a defining moment. On that day, Nicolae Ceaușescu stood on a balcony in Bucharest and publicly condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The footage shows a defiant leader shouting into the microphone, his fist clenched against Moscow. It was a bold gamble, but it worked. Why did the West embrace a communist dictator? It seemed illogical, but the enemy of their enemy was a friend. Richard Nixon flew to Bucharest in 1969. Trade deals were signed. Even Charles de Gaulle offered praise for this independent path. Ceausescu was the darling of the West. At first glance, a reformer on the world stage, but in reality, a tyrant tightening the screws at home. His primary weapon was the Securitate. Originally formed in 1948, this agency evolved into a monster under Ceausescu's command. By the 1980s, the numbers were staggering. 11,000 full-time officers, more than 500,000 informants. They were everywhere, in factories, in schools, in the smallest villages. Privacy ceased to exist. Agents steamed open letters and resealed them. They installed bugs in lamps, telephones, and wall sockets. The recordings capture everything: whispers, arguments, even silence. If a citizen criticized the regime, the response was swift. A knock on the door, interrogation, disappearance. Fear became the national currency. No one spoke openly, not even to their spouses. But the terror had two faces. Enter Elena Ceausescu. Despite leaving school at 14, she demanded recognition as a scientific genius. By 1980, she was deputy prime minister. She collected honorary degrees like souvenirs. In the footage, she accepts awards she cannot read. She controlled key ministries and the Academy of Sciences. Competence meant nothing. Loyalty was the only qualification. This was no longer a government, it was a cult. School children stood in rows, reciting poems about the genius of the Carpathians. Portraits of the couple hung in every office, train station, and classroom. The leader's face was inescapable. To reshape the country, Ceausescu declared war on the past. Bulldozers tore through historic centers. Ancient churches crumbled into dust. Traditional villages were erased from the map. He replaced them with concrete blocks and uniform boulevards. Everything looked organized from the air. But down on the street, the foundation was rotting. 1981. That was the year the illusion finally shattered. Cracks were not just forming, they were tearing the foundation apart. Throughout the 1970s, Ceausescu had courted Western banks. Massive loans poured into Bucharest. The goal was ambitious: to transform Romania into an industrial titan. He ordered the construction of colossal factories, steel plants, and chemical complexes. Smokestacks rose over the horizon. Machinery hummed. But the output did not match the investment. Why did the plan fail? The projects were poorly managed. They bled money instead of generating profit. The economy stalled. It could not grow fast enough to service the interest. By 1981, the state treasury was empty. The country stood on the brink of total bankruptcy. Ceausescu made a choice. He would repay every single cent. He branded it a heroic national effort. But for the population, it was not heroism, it was a sentence. To save currency, the dictator slashed imports. He cut everything: grain, meat, fuel, medicine. Romanian factories continued to run, but not for Romanians. The government forced them to export nearly 100% of their production. Trains loaded with wheat and cattle crossed the border. Meanwhile, local grocery shelves collected dust. Strict rationing hit hard in 1981. The state calculated survival down to the gram. Each citizen received a monthly allowance: 500 grams of sugar, 1 liter of oil, a handful of eggs. Meat vanished from the legal market entirely. It became a black market luxury, sold in dark alleys for exorbitant prices. Energy vanished next. The government shut off electricity for hours every day to feed the factories. Gasoline became liquid gold. Drivers queued for days to receive just a few liters per week. Even water taps in apartment blocks ran dry to conserve pumping energy. Then came the cold. By 1985, winter heating collapsed. In major cities like Bucharest, Iasi, and Cluj, radiators stayed cold. The temperature inside concrete apartment blocks dropped to freezing. The footage is stark. Windows are covered in ice, not on the outside, but on the inside. People did not take off their coats when they entered their homes. They slept in jackets, they cooked over candles or dangerous makeshift burners. Survival became the only priority. The consequences were immediate and fatal. The infant mortality rate spiked. By 1988, Romania recorded 23 deaths per 1,000 live births. It was one of the worst rates in Europe. Hospitals turned into warehouses for the dying. They lacked basic aspirin. They lacked antibiotics. The shortage forced doctors into brutal decisions. They reused disposable syringes. They performed surgeries without anesthesia. The screams were audible in the hallways. In schools, malnutrition became visible. Children fainted at their desks during lessons. The Securitate controlled food inspections. They falsified reports. They blocked the data. The world saw nothing. At first glance, a modern state. But in reality, a humanitarian disaster. While the people froze, Ceausescu traveled in bulletproof limousines. He gave speeches about the golden era. He claimed the people were happy, healthy, and well-fed. But his obsession lay elsewhere. In 1984, he launched his most extreme project, the Palace of the People. The scale was monstrous. It became the second-largest administrative building in the world, second only to the Pentagon. Over 1,000 rooms, gold-plated ceilings, halls lined with marble. To build this monument to himself, Ceausescu declared war on the city. Bulldozers leveled entire historic neighborhoods, monasteries crumbled, schools collapsed. Over 7 square kilometers of residential homes turned to rubble. 40,000 people lost their homes. The state relocated them by force into tiny, unfinished concrete boxes. No heat, no privacy. Propaganda covered the tracks. Romanian state television broadcast only 2 hours a day. The screen showed endless applause for Ceausescu and his wife, Elena. The press printed lies. Newspapers published photos of markets overflowing with food and workers smiling in the fields. But no one believed the ink. People saw the truth in their own kitchens. They saw it in the long, silent lines at 4 a.m. They saw it on their empty dinner tables. Anger did not explode yet. It festered behind closed doors. Families whispered about escape. They discussed fighting back. But they checked the phone lines for bugs first. They knew the price of dissent was death. December 1989. The map of Europe was burning. On November 9th, the Berlin Wall collapsed under the weight of sledgehammers and sledgehammers. In Prague, peaceful crowds flooded Wenceslas Square. In Warsaw, solidarity seized power from the communists. Even Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow loosened his grip on the empire. But in Bucharest, silence reigned. Nicolae Ceaușescu refused to budge. He believed his fortress was impenetrable. He thought Romania was immune to the virus of freedom. He was wrong. Why did the explosion start in Timișoara? It was close to the Yugoslav and Hungarian borders. Information seeped through the cracks here faster than in the capital. People tuned into foreign radio. They knew the truth. On December 15th, the Securitate arrived at a modest building. Their target was Laszlo Tokes, a Hungarian-speaking pastor, a man who dared to speak about hunger and state repression. The secret police had clear orders: evict the pastor, exile him to a remote village, make him disappear. But this was only the beginning. When the black cars arrived, the parishioners did not leave. They stood shoulder to shoulder. They linked arms. A human chain formed around the pastor's home. Night fell. The crowd grew. It wasn't just Baptists anymore. Students, factory workers, and neighbors joined the line. They lit candles. The chant changed. First, they shouted for Tokes. Then, they shouted for liberty. "Down with Ceausescu!" The roar echoed off the concrete apartment blocks. For the first time in decades, the barrier of fear shattered. The footage from that night is grainy and dark. You can see the steam rising from the breath of thousands in the cold air. You can hear the defiant singing of banned songs. The regime panicked. Police units pushed into the square. Water cannons blasted the freezing protesters. Tear gas canisters smoked on the pavement, but the people held their ground. Violence escalated. Then came the order. December 17th. The army raised their rifles. Live ammunition tore through the crowd. Officers fired directly into the mass of people. The government officially admitted to 73 deaths. At first glance, a tragedy. But in reality, a calculated massacre. Witnesses claimed hundreds fell that day. The bloodshed did not end with the shooting. Secret police agents infiltrated the hospitals. Doctors received strict instructions: no treatment unless the patient remained silent. Wounded protesters were interrogated on stretchers. In the morgues, a darker operation began. Agents stole bodies. They loaded corpses into unmarked trucks and drove them to Bucharest. They cremated the dead to turn the evidence into ash. Families wandered the corridors searching for missing sons, daughters, and parents. They found only empty beds. There was no turning back. But terror failed. The violence did not paralyze the nation. It ignited it. News of the slaughter traveled over the airwaves. Radio Free Europe broadcast the screams of Timișoara to the rest of the country. In Bucharest, in Cluj, in Sibiu, people listened in their kitchens. The lie was over. Crowds in other cities began to mobilize. The revolution had begun. Nicolae Ceaușescu sat in his palace, surrounded by gold and tapestries. He prepared to face the reality he had denied for 20 years. The threat was not a foreign invasion. It was his own people. December 21st, 1989. That was the date the illusion of power finally shattered. On that morning, Nicolae Ceaușescu still believed he held total control over Romania. He had just returned from a brief diplomatic visit to Iran. He was unaware that the ground beneath him was already cracking. Why did he feel so safe? He lived in a bubble of yes men. But that bubble was about to burst. He stepped out onto the balcony of the Central Committee building in Bucharest. Everything seemed to follow the script. Tens of thousands of people filled University Square. Party officials had forced them there. Security agents had bussed them in. They handed out flags and banners. They told the crowd to clap on cue. State television was broadcasting live. The cameras focused on Ceaușescu. Behind him stood his wife, Elena, and several top officials. They were arranged like statues. His voice echoed over the square. He repeated the standard propaganda. He blamed foreign agitators for the unrest in the West. He called for unity. He praised the victories of socialism. But then, the impossible happened. From somewhere deep in the crowd, a murmur began. It grew louder. Someone booed, then another, then hundreds. Soon, the square roared with noise. It was not applause, it was anger. People jeered. They shouted anti-Ceaușescu slogans. The footage shows. The dictator pauses mid-sentence. His face twists in confusion. He did not understand. He raised his hand. He used his usual gesture to silence them. It was a command. But it did not work. The noise only intensified. At first glance, a standard political rally. But in reality, a trial by public opinion. For the first time in 25 years, the audience broke the script. For decades, the people had clapped when told. They smiled when filmed. They cheered on command. Now, in front of the entire country, they refused. Panic hit the balcony. Aides swarmed the dictator. The live feed cut to black. Cameras turned away to hide the embarrassment. Inside the Central Committee building, officials scrambled. Some tried to lie to Ceaușescu. They called it a minor provocation, but he knew something bigger had shifted. That same night, the crowds returned. No one told them to come this time. Protests spilled into the surrounding streets. Clashes erupted between demonstrators and police. Tear gas filled the air. The smell of burning rubber mixed with shouting. People fought back with stones. They fought with bare hands. By the morning of December 22nd, Bucharest was in chaos. Protesters stormed the Central Committee building. The military fractured. Some soldiers still obeyed the regime, but many turned their guns outward to protect the crowds. Firefights broke out in the streets, the camera records, armored vehicles rolling through intersections. Drivers hesitated. They did not know whether to attack or defend. Ceaușescu watched from the top floor. He saw the gates buckle under the pressure of the masses. It was 11:30 in the morning. They could no longer hold the building. Security rushed Ceaușescu and Elena to the rooftop. A white Puma helicopter waited. Colonel Vasile Maluțan was at the controls. The rotors spun up. They lifted off just as the mob flooded the main hall below. Ceaușescu believed he had escaped, but the sky offered no safety. As they flew westward, air traffic control broadcasted urgent messages. The military command had flipped. Ceaușescu was now a target. The helicopter received orders to land. The pilot made a choice. He claimed the fuel was low. He brought the helicopter down near Târgoviște, 80 kilometers northwest of the capital. From there, the dictator and his wife were on foot. Locals drove them in regular cars. The drivers were nervous. At one point, the fugitives hid in a countryside schoolyard. They knocked on doors. They begged for help. Some residents slammed their doors shut. Others gave them bread but refused to look them in the eye. Word spread fast. Fear evaporated. Fury took its place. By the afternoon, a group of local policemen found them. These officers had aligned with the new Revolutionary Council. They took the couple into custody. There was no resistance. Ceaușescu tried to speak. He insisted he was still the rightful president. The officers did not respond. Their silence was the answer. The era was over. Silence answered them. The couple was dragged into a military garrison in Târgoviște. It was a cold, gray complex of concrete that had once served as a standard army base. Now, it was a cage where history would shift. There was no trial scheduled on the docket. No judge had been selected. No defense lawyer had been contacted. Soldiers simply shoved the prisoners into a plain room. Inside, there were only 2 iron army beds, a single toilet, and a stack of rough blankets. 3 soldiers stood inside the room to watch them. They never looked away. Ceaușescu acted like nothing had changed. He paced the small floor. He demanded access to a telephone line. He asked for his staff to be summoned. He stood tall, called himself the President of the Socialist Republic of Romania, and refused to answer any questions from his captors. Elena was even more combative. She did not just speak, she spat insults. She called the young guards traitors. She called them fools. At one point, she lunged and tried to scratch the face of a soldier who brought her a tray. Why did they refuse to eat? They claimed the bread and meat were poisoned. The physical deterioration was rapid. They did not change their clothes. They did not bathe. Ceaușescu's shoes were torn and scuffed. Elena's hair became a tangled, uncombed mess. The camera records, their faces are gaunt and pale. They looked nothing like the polished, all-powerful rulers the Romanians had seen on state television for decades. But outside the base, chaos reigned. The revolution was not fully settled. Fighting continued in the streets of Bucharest and other major cities. 1,100 people had already died. Most of these casualties occurred in the violent days after Ceaușescu fled the capital. The new leadership, led by Ion Iliescu, sat in a bunker and sweated. They feared a counterattack. Intelligence reports suggested that Ceaușescu loyalists were regrouping. Rumors flew that elite army divisions or secret Securitate units might try to storm the garrison and rescue the couple. At first glance, the regime had fallen, but in reality, a civil war was hours away. Iliescu and his advisors made a hard choice. A fast trial, no delays, no appeal process. The people needed closure, and the new government needed a body. Events accelerated. On the morning of December 25, 1989, soldiers arranged a makeshift courtroom inside the base. It was a small, bare room, barely large enough to hold the participants. Tables were pushed together. 4 military judges sat behind a wooden table. 2 defense lawyers stood nearby, but they remained silent and pale. Everyone in that room knew this was not a normal trial. It was a procedure being filmed for proof. The world needed to see that the dictator and his wife were finally being held accountable, no matter how rushed or messy it looked. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were marched in under heavy guard. They looked confused and angry. They still wore the same heavy coats they had slept in for days. The charges were read out quickly. The prosecutor accused them of genocide. He claimed they caused the deaths of over 60,000 people during the uprising, though that number was never officially confirmed. They were accused of wrecking the economy, stealing billions of dollars, and trying to flee the country instead of facing their people. Most of the accusations did not come with solid evidence. There were no stacks of documents. No witnesses were called to the stand. But no one in the room doubted the guilt. The country was in ruins, bodies lay in the streets, and the blame pointed squarely at the two people in the heavy coats. Nicolae was furious. He kept shouting that the trial was illegal. He slammed his hand on the table. He said only the Grand National Assembly had the legal right to judge a president. He quoted the Romanian constitution, waving his hands and ignoring the judges completely. He refused to recognize the court's authority. He claimed the revolution was a fake coup pushed by foreign powers. The footage shows Elena refuses to sit down. She screamed at the guards. She looked at a soldier and ordered him to kneel before her, still believing she held absolute power. But no one listened. The soldiers checked their weapons. 55 minutes. That was the total duration of the proceedings. The judges did not waste time on deliberation. They flipped through the files. The verdict was written before the trial even began. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was absolute. Death by firing squad. Immediate execution. Why did they rush the procedure? It seemed like a legal formality. But fear drove the decision. The new government needed the Ceausescus dead before loyalist forces could mount a rescue. There were no final statements. Nicolae and Elena were not granted a moment for goodbyes or last requests. Soldiers grabbed them by the arms. They did not escort them, they dragged them. The couple was hustled out of the makeshift courtroom and into the freezing courtyard. It was Christmas Day, but the scene was purely violent. Events accelerated. Soldiers raided a nearby supply area and returned with ropes. They bound Nicolae and Elena together, back to back. The knots were tight. No blindfolds were offered. The camera records. Elena fights against the soldiers. Her voice is shrill. She screams, demanding they not be separated. She shouts that they have the right to die together. Nicolae tried to drown out her panic. He raised his voice. He began to chant fragments of the Internationale. He shouted patriotic slogans, convinced that history would vindicate him as a hero. But the acoustics were unforgiving. His words bounced off the cold concrete walls and faded. No crowds were listening. No secret police rushed to save him. At first glance, a chaotic military drill. But in reality, the dismantling of a regime. 9 paratroopers lined up. They raised their assault rifles. Not every soldier wanted to pull the trigger, but disobedience was impossible. An officer stepped forward. He gave the command. 2:50 in the afternoon. The sound of automatic fire erupted. It wasn't a single volley. It was a barrage. Dozens of bullets struck the couple in less than 3 seconds. Nicolae's body folded instantly. His knees gave out, and he dropped to the hard ground. Elena fell moments later. She was still screaming when the lead hit her. The smoke cleared slowly. The bodies lay in the snow. There was no ceremony. No priest offered a prayer. Just 2 lifeless figures wrapped in heavy winter coats, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and the silence of the courtyard. But the mission was not over. Soldiers wrapped the corpses in canvas sheets. A helicopter waited nearby, its rotors already spinning. The pilot had 2 pieces of cargo to transport back to Bucharest, the bodies and the videotape. This footage was the proof the country needed. The man who demanded statues in every town now had nothing. No tomb, no legacy. Only a few seconds of grainy film showing his collapse. That evening, the signal went out on TVR. The news anchor looked into the lens. He was visibly shaking. For 25 years, every broadcast had begun with praise for the genius of the Carpathians. Now, the anchor opened with a single short phrase, "The dictator is dead." Then they played the tape. Millions of Romanians sat in silence. In apartments with cracked windows and no heat, families huddled around black and white television sets. They wore coats indoors to survive the winter chill. They watched their past die on the screen. The footage shows the tyrant's body lying in the dirt. Some wept. They did not cry for Ceausescu. They cried for the decades lost under his rule. Others cheered. Many just stared blankly. The era of fear was finished.